You're listening to Energy Solutions, a podcast from the Electric Power Supply Association, where we unpack the stories, policy debates, and trends behind America's power grid. I'm your host, Todd Snitchler, President and CEO of EPSA. In this conversation, you'll hear from Nate Hanson, President of LS Power Generation, Speaker Matt Huffman from the Ohio House of Representatives, Sherman, the CEO of Competitive Power Ventures, and Gordon van Welie, former President and CEO of the ISO New England. The panel was moderated by Kathryn Clay, Lead Energy and Climate Analyst at the Washington Post Intelligence. This conversation covers everything from state-level decision-making and market design to permitting challenges, transmission constraints, and the growing impact of large energy users like data centers. At the core of it is a simple but important question. Who is responsible for making sure there's enough power on the system, and how do we get the incentives right to support that? Here's the panel.
But Gordon, I would love it with your decades of experience and now, again, your free agent status. If you could just give us the lay of the land, how well are we doing? And if you could have a straight talk, honest conversation with a state policymaker, what would you tell them their North Star should be?
So I think it's pretty obvious we're not doing that well at the moment. It's sort of the understatement. And, you had shared some questions and I had a chance to look at them. And, the question of, what's the one thing that I would change in order to help rebalance the system? It would be having the states take more ownership of resource and energy adequacy for their states and their regions. Because I think that will drive lots of good behaviors. And the market, I think, has worked really well to attract hundreds of billions of dollars worth of private investment. But if you look at what's happened in recent years, there's lots of frictions in the system that are impeding the ability of the market to respond. And so then, if you go through a little thought experiment and you say, well, stripping out markets and ISOs and RTOs and the FERC, who should be responsible for resource adequacy? Is it supply or is it load? The answer is pretty obvious, right? Load. Each one of us has to make provision for ourselves in our private lives. And to the extent the states are representing retail consumers, I'm going to slice out industrial and commercial, they're big enough to handle themselves. Then you would say, okay, so the states need to make sure that they've made provision for their citizens, right? And so, whether you achieve that through bilateral arrangements or setting up power authorities or asking your utility to build stuff, in the end, the accountability has to rest with the states. And I think then that drives positive behaviors around siting and permitting. Because once you feel accountable, you'll do something about it. And so then, when I look at what's happened, across the US and elsewhere in the world, it seems to me the areas that are working best, they're not necessarily always the most elegant in terms of market design, but the single jurisdiction areas, California, Texas, New York, UK, pick your New Zealand, pick your spot in the world where things working relatively well is where there is a very close alignment between the state, the grid operator, the market operator, and the utilities. Where things come adrift, where there are multi-state arrangements where people have sort of washed their hands of responsibility and they're pointing at somebody else to solve the problem. So to me, you start with getting the accountabilities right, and then the rest of it derives from that. And so there's, a lot more to unpack in that. That's kind of the way I think about it.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much. I think that as our state policymaker, I maybe should give the next turn to respond to Speaker Huffman. So how do you feel about that assessment that the part of the heart of it is more ownership at the state level?
Well, first of all, I think it's fascinating because it becomes a shock to many of you, but legislators don't immediately know everything when they get elected. And the difference between a municipal electric and the co-op and what is PJM, which I think I figured that out about my fourth year in the legislature, someone explained that to me. But one of the things that, there's a representative of PJM here, and there's always one somewhere in the Ohio State House, is that Ohio can't survive unless there's PJM, which that's the job of representatives of PJM. Meanwhile, MISO is saying you'd be better off with us. But I think it's a fascinating remark, and it makes sense. It's the model for a lot of successful entities, McDonald's, hamburgers, the Catholic Church. We're going to make you in charge of what's going on here locally. Always have to be ultimately responsible to us. But so it makes sense that states would be in charge of it. But that's not the way we're functioning now. We're a long way from doing that. Certainly Ohio is. But one of the things we're trying to do in Ohio now is create a prospect where people are going to be successful if they take their own risk with a free market approach. And we're getting away from, let's make sure there's some money there and hope things work out. So we're not quite where the speaker was suggesting we should be, but we're getting closer.
If I could follow on that, so I understand that not so long ago there was an important bill passed in Ohio, HB 15, and how would you characterize the contribution of that legislation? How is that positioning Ohio to lead or to take more ownership?
Right. Well, this organization birthed that bill, not metaphorically, of course, but Todd Schnitzler and I met in 2008 when I was trying to get him elected to the Ohio House. I was in charge of the campaigns back there. Todd, of course, went on to the PUCO. And last April of 2025, we're all expressing the same problems that you are, rising costs, additional demand from mega users like data centers. And I met with Todd and said, what should it look like in a state to solve this problem, to create more energy and try to deal with these things? And that was April of 2025, and about 2024. And about September of 2024, a giant pad of paper ended up on my desk. We had worked through our LSC. At the time, I was the Senate president. Rob McCauley was going to be the Senate president, which he is now in 2025 in this GA. And we determined collectively that was not going to pass in the 2024 General Assembly because of some dysfunction at the House at the time. We both dropped that, one in the Senate and one in the House. The sponsor of the bill, Roy Kloffenstein, is here today in the House, and we worked it. And I think that, frankly, people looked at this as an extraordinary thing. It changed how we did things in Ohio. And therefore, because it was such an extraordinary change, it didn't have any chance of passing. And I'll make this comment too, that because of the scandal with First Energy, which has been ongoing for 5 years or so, and which tangentially involves some of the utilities weren't at their normal lobbying capability. And frankly, there was an injured industry in Ohio, and in short, that helped us get this bill passed. So it does some extraordinary things. I'm sure you had a chance to talk about that. But that bill really, for the first time in Ohio, incentivizes free market energy creation. And it does that in a variety of different ways, removes some things that we were doing, and I'm sure we'll get to talk about it more.
Oh, that's great. Thank you for the insider information. It reminds me of the phrase that every crisis is an opportunity, right? So
yeah.
Nelson's crisis maybe became legislature.
We don't often quote Rahm Emanuel in Ohio, but it is.
That's fair.
Yeah.
Well, I'd love to turn to our representatives of the business community now. So in states, in conversations with state policymakers, what is it you would like to communicate to your interlocutors on the other side of what business needs to make investments in the state? And maybe I'll go to Nate first. Thank you. And then to Sherman. Great.
Sure. Look, I think it's important to think about why we are where we are, right? I mean, a lot of the dysfunction the marketplace, and Gordon focused on New England. Same in New England as PJM for the most part. We have various state initiatives and policies that have really led us to a path where reliable, dispatchable generation hasn't been really able to have been built. So granted, we didn't need it. We subsidized renewables. We were shifting to a lower carbon generation mix. And so there were certain states where you wouldn't even think about developing certain types of resources because you would never get through the permitting process. Or there were laws passed that would prevent it, such as in Virginia, for example. So that's kind of where we got, how we got to where we are. And now all of a sudden we have load growth and we can't rely on the intermittent generation. We think intermittent generation is great. I think we need every megawatt we can get, but we do need facilities that can turn on when you need to turn on and be able to provide, 24/7 power on a more reliable basis. As Stacy mentioned from Vistra, there's a lot of resources that are either constrained from transmission issues or permit issues that could be utilized at a much higher capacity factor to support more round-the-clock generation. So that would be a place where states can start in terms of being open to new permitting paradigms, if you will. But what comes along with that, stress on the gas. There's been many states, in New York, we've seen it all through New England, who will, permit new gas pipelines or expansions of existing pipelines. And, very similar to the transmission system, when we start using more power, you start to use up the capacity that's available on that system. And the gas system, especially in the Northeast, is very tight now when we get to those peak times. So when you add load growth on top of that, the utilization rates will go up and those peak times will become more severe. It'll be very much harder to manage those in the coming years than it has been. But I think we need to revisit the policies that some of the states have put themselves in. That has led to the situation we're in. We see certain states, Pennsylvania, Ohio, West Virginia, have been very accommodating to new generation development. It helps that there's a lot of gas situated around those states, but they've also, since the load growth really started to present itself, we started having it into our forward forecast. They've been accommodating. They've created committees to come out, economic development, as well as permitting committees to go out and be able to facilitate that development, not just for the data centers, because they do want the economic development, but how they're going to power the data centers. So this all goes to taking more of a leadership and maybe, as Gordon put it, as taking responsibility for the cost structure and really the reliability that you're going to have in place to serve the customers.
Great, thank you. Sherman, your thoughts?
Thanks. There's a lot to digest here. I'll try and be relatively quick. But first, I do want to, I think you brought up a very interesting point. Gordon, about states taking more ownership over reliability. I have the first time, and maybe it's just me, but I've never heard California, New York being the epitome of, good regulatory market.
I'll expand my thought.
Yeah, I would like to hear a little bit more. But I think from our perspective, I have a very simple job, right? We own generation, we develop and build generation. I focus on, what's making a good profitable investment, and how to manage that, and being good stewards of that capital. I think what's important here is that the framework is not shifting. And so whether it's the states or whether it's a more regional approach, I think it's really important that the more stable that is, it drives the investor return requirement down and you get to more affordability. One of the things with states going it alone, in terms of only thinking myopically about their own states, is they don't take into advantage of the overall competitive advantages of all the different states and be able to pool that together at, I think, a potentially lower cost.
Big proponents of, competitive markets. And I think HB 15 is an area that it's not surprising you're seeing a significant amount of generation going to, looking to build in Ohio. I think that's, creating a regulatory environment that's very supportive. And then I guess finally, just on the nuts and bolts of, developing new generation, permitting is important. And not so much always getting to a yes or no, but getting to an answer. We've been in processes where, just completing an application, getting to an answer can take up to a decade. That's not acceptable. I'd much rather get a no quickly. And that's fine. So, I think HB 15 actually is another good example of that, not to keep bouncing back to that one, where the answer comes quick. And it quickly. It doesn't necessarily have to be always yes, which is fine. And then state, supporting, I would say around a reasonable rate of return. And that's probably, a very amorphous, definition of whether that's a state or whether they're supportive of a market mechanism, that allows for that. But obviously as an investor, you don't want to get into a situation where, on the downside, you can, lose all your money, and on the upside, the max you can get is a 10% return. That's not going to be conducive for a good investment environment. Now, having said that, you kind of, you reduce the uncertainty around that. It doesn't have to be a crazy amount of return. Like investors can get very comfortable with, a reasonable rate of return and reducing that. So going back to kind of where states can kind of play into that, it's like creating the regulatory environment, focusing on, is it, I think from my perspective, I think there's greater value in being in competitive markets for ratepayers, and then keeping that, that mechanism by which, you're compensating, is relatively stable as possible. The other one on that is, I have to throw out, Texas, obviously they supported through a subsidized loan, the Texas Energy Fund. That obviously is one of the key components of why we're building in Texas right now, 1.4 gigawatt, project. So it's another way that states can support. I'm not saying that's the only way, but that's another way that obviously, supports additional generation growth.
Gordon, did that spark a thought for you?
Yeah, so Sherman, I'm glad you raised the question about, why do I hold up California or Texas as a model? I do that, I'm thinking of it only in the sense of accountability. I'm not speaking to the elegance of the market design. And, I think you can look at that. You can look at what they're doing in the different areas and critique them as much as anywhere else. I think my comment is really driven by the fight over resource adequacy over the years. Wind back the clock. We followed PJM into a full capacity market back in 2004. Why? Because the states said they wanted that. And at the time, our inclination was a spark capacity auction, which is what New England's going back to. So I've had a lot of time to contemplate this issue. And so, I think it's the job of the ISO to price the prevailing supply and demand conditions, both in the energy and the capacity market. The capacity market only exists because of caps in the energy market. It's the missing money issue, right? So it's really not the ISO's job to hedge load. And it's not FERC's job to hedge load. It's load's job to hedge load, right? That's the problem. So I think when we got into the cycle where we said, now it's suddenly the ISO's job to hedge load by running on forward auction and doing long-term contracting, all the rest of it. The real vulnerability with that construct is that ISOs are what's the opposite of impervious? Totally susceptible to political pressure. Yeah. Right? So you apply enough pressure to an ISO, just look at what's happened in recent times, and they will buckle under the political pressure. And just look at the MOPA wars and all the rest of it, right? All of that was about trying to keep the price whole for state interventions in the marketplace. So, and then to, come out with an argument that says, well, if you do this and you do that, it's not going to be good for reliability, that falls on deaf ears. Nobody believes that story until the lights go out. So the question then becomes, how do you get people to take responsibility for what they're doing? And so that's why I say I think the wholesale market construct is very powerful. I mean, the energy markets and ancillary service markets are working fantastically well. They're producing billions of dollars of efficiency. The real rub comes in on the resource adequacy side of things. How do we make sure that we have enough? And then I listened to the debate this morning about forecasting. Peter Lake said it right. There's no way that you can forecast accurately. So to think that you can ask an ISO who's collecting second and third hand information together and stitching it together, and everybody's using different forecasting methodologies, that's a fool's errand. So the thing to do is to get the ISO out of the forecasting game with regard to resource adequacy and to say the load, that's on you. You figure out how much you think you're going to need, right? And you then figure out whether you want to utilize effectively the backstop auction that the ISO is running, the spot auction, which is going to produce a penalty price if you're short in the market and discipline you to go long. So if I sort of stand back and look at what happened, a lot of states got complacent and for many years we were long, right? And so it was okay to be short. There was no downside to that. And then suddenly we went short and everybody is sitting trying to buy in a short market and the prices are spiking. And then you get the political reaction that we're all dealing with, which is put a cap on the market. And then we have folk in this room saying, oh, but the market price doesn't cover the cost of building something new. Well, we've set the system up to fail. So I think we've got to get back to a place where nobody looks at the New York Stock Exchange and says, why aren't you looking after consumers? The exchange is just clearing the result of buyers and sellers transacting. And I think that was the original objective of setting up these markets. And so really what I'm advocating for is there needs to be more accountability on the buy side for making sure that they've transacted with the sell side to cover their position. And however you do that, that's going to end up being a smorgasbord of things. Every region state is going to go off and do their own thing, and they're going to have to evaluate what's the most efficient way of doing that. And my argument would be, I think don't mess with the energy and ancillary services markets. Decide what you want to do in terms of your hedging strategy. Use bilateral hedging, and there's going to be plenty enough business for IPPs to participate in that. I'm not advocating for everything to go back to cost of service regulation. I want to be clear about that. I'm very in support of capitalism and free markets, and I think the point was made earlier today. Where's Todd? I'll give him his amen on. That's the money we need in order just to scale the system. But I think the mess we've gotten ourselves into right now is because we have allowed accountabilities to become fuzzy. And so then that gets tangled up in the political rhetoric and swings back and forth from cycle to cycle.
Nate, you've been in this business a long time. How would you see some of Gordon's recommendations play out? Would that be a way of creating opportunity for business, or is it putting too much responsibility on businesses' shoulders?
No, look, I think we have some markets that put that responsibility on the business. I mean, California, not to hold up California, because their lights do, I think, brown out more than spoke lights. But, I think the issue there is they put the PUC along with the ISO put the loads, the capacity procurement obligation on the load server. So very similar to a bilateral contracting market. And then suppliers compete for that business. So we're kind of entering into a phase where there's going to be significantly more bilateral contracting in what we call the restructured markets in the Northeast, because it necessitates it. And load servers, whether it be co-ops and munis or whether it be data centers, want to have certainty around their energy costs going forward. I think bilateral contracting is a great way to do that, and it should be facilitated through whatever means we can, whether it be state economic development councils or whether it be through PJM. So I think, I think putting the obligation on the load server is really where we're at. It's very hard in these competitive markets where the rules are changing, month to month or 6 months over 6 months to be able to really have a lot of confidence in your investment, especially when the existing levels wouldn't support the new build economics into the market structures that we have. And we've heard earlier today where you can go and bilaterally contract at higher levels than most likely what the market will provide, and they're more certain for longer terms. So that will actually get projects built more quickly. I think one of the big questions still is, if we're in a period where it's significantly more expensive to develop projects today. The amount of capital required to put at risk, both because of equipment deposits as well as interconnection deposits as you work through that process. There's a lot more at risk in terms of investor capital before you know if your project's really going to move forward and it's economic. And that, I think, is something to the extent we can address through certainty through the interconnection process, which there's several initiatives right now ongoing to try to provide more, faster visibility into what that cost structure will look like. I think will improve kind of and streamline the ability to get more generation in place more quickly.
True. Out. Mr. Speaker, did you have a thought on any of that?
Well, I guess the short answer is no, because I don't understand most of it, to be very honest with you. This bilateral contract, I'm a lawyer, and I've drafted a lot of contracts, but in this, the two questions that folks like me asked when we went to the House Bill 15, and certainly Roy knows more about the details. The two questions we asked were, how can we make it fair? So we had to get rid of all of the incentives that the EDUs had. So we got rid of those. We made them come in and produce a plan on how they were going to get. So we got rid of the unfairness. We then created a system. But then the next question was, what are we going to do with all these mega users, especially now in Ohio, behind the data centers. So 15 years ago, Governor John Kasich said, we need to get data centers to come to Ohio, get them out of California and Oregon and Arizona. And so we did a bunch of things, including exempting them from paying sales tax on their building materials. And that was, because, it was visionary then 15 years ago. Well, now there are so many of them coming. It's a problem because, as we say, Bob and Betty Buckeye, this is a Todd Schnitzler line. You've heard him say it before. He wants the beer cold, the lights on, and the house warm. That's all they care about. Now, if we can say we have all these other industries and all that, that's fine. But they're not interested in John Kasich's vision of data centers. And so our challenge, essentially, to the bill drafters and the folks who are working this is, well, how do we get a different system for all of those people? Not just data centers, but for oil refineries and steel foundries, these very heavy users, not a hotel, frankly, or a Walmart, as someone's mentioned in the last panel. And so what we said was, just build your own power plant right there on the grounds where you're at. It's the behind-the-meter plan that we have. And as we talked about that a little bit, we said, they won't always have the land there. And by the way, what if there was another project down the road? And so we made it more expansive. You can now you can build the plant and you can enter into a contract to sell the power to another user or a third party. And so it is outside the normal utility distribution process. And I had in mind, and I'll just say this to all folks who are in the industry who are building plants, and the great city of Lima, Ohio, where I grew up, where John Rockefeller built his first refinery 140 years ago in 1885, that refinery is still there. It's the longest continuously operating refinery in the world. And a few empty industrial lots over is what used to be the Ohio Steel Foundry, but it's still an active steel foundry. In between is a huge swath of land where we used to build steam locomotives, the largest builder of steam locomotives in the world. And that is now empty. Well, we said, That's where you should go, not out across from a brand new housing subdivision to make all those people upset and township trustees say don't want to look at it. And so we incentivize, additionally in House Bill 15, the building of these in what are called brownfield. Come to Ohio, you want to build a power generating entity, some facility of some kind, you're going to get a permit in 90 days. Now, that's, I think, unheard of any place else. Now, it doesn't mean you're going to have the plant bill, of course, in 90 days. That's up to you. So, legislators like me, we're all generalists. I know a lot about suing people in Western Ohio, but we're generalists. And so we come up with these general ideas. It's up to smart people like the people in this room and this panel to help us. But those are where we've got to on House Bill 15 and trying to solve some of these problems.
Have you started to see investment? Is it too soon to tell, or are the signs good?
Yeah, I had a great caucus a couple of weeks ago. Our Republicans meet, and there were 4 or 5 people who voted no. That we use a lot. What's the political strategy to get it done? The question is really legislative strategy. When we went to vote on this bill, of course, we needed 50 of 99 votes, and we had about 45 the morning of that vote. And there were some lean no's and some not sure's, and can't be there. I might have to go to the doctor votes, about 10 or 12 of those. And I just said, these people are not going to vote no on this bill. But the strategy that the utilities and other folks didn't want it, but one of them, which is one of the more inventive one, was, well, if this passes, it's going to hurt the stock price of the utilities in Ohio. And therefore, all the pensions in Ohio that are invested in that, this is going to hurt the retirees, police, and firemen. And of course, for some legislators who'd be like, well, I can't do that. Until you explain to them, and I wish I could take credit for Rob McCauley's line. He said, it is not the policy of the Ohio General Assembly to try and enhance stock prices on the New York Stock Exchange. And so getting through all of that and explaining it to the legislators and getting to a point where you can have success is great. And so what's happened since last April, there have been 7 new gas-powered electric plants either sited or applied to be sited in the state of Ohio. I don't know why all of the things that President Trump does, what he does, but we're happy to say that in his announcement, the Japanese fund is supposed to spend $33 billion in central South Ohio towards building energy generation. $33 billion is a lot of money. And we think it's because the way that we have structured this bill to allow people to be financially successful.
Thank you very much, then.
Yes, come to Ohio.
Yeah,
we're not just good in football. That's for the Michigan people. All
right, so I will now might stay over here behind my notebook the rest of the panelists. I wonder, I'm fascinated, Gordon, as you were speaking about some of the endemic problems that you diagnosed, and the political permeability of some of the institutions. Would we still have these problems if we were not entering such an enormous era of load growth? Has that just accelerated the visibility of the disconnects? Would we always have had this problem, or is this something that's just taken our system at the seam in a way we couldn't have expected?
I think that the moment was coming, right? It's just when was it going to arrive? And the thing that is flipped over is AI did the demand, right? But I think we would have reached this point. We had electrification demand to equal. Look at New England, it has to double its demand in the next 2 to 3 decades if it's to achieve the decarbonization goals. So that demand would have pushed us to the same place, same thing in the United States. So it's really just, it was there within the system, it was latent within the system. So I want to go back to something else and link back to what Nate said. what do you need in order to have a robust market? You need regulatory stability. You need willing buyers and sellers, right? And the other thing is you need to have a robust network infrastructure. There are two networks that are crucial. And they mention both the transmission network and the gas network, right? So, and where we got the biggest impediments to market response, it's in the transmission network and the gas. Why is that? Because of dysfunction between the federal government and the states over time, and states not necessarily taking ownership of the fact that they need to also make sure that the lights stay on in Egypt. And you get a lot of friction comes through the system that impedes the ability of the market. Which are the states that are actually allowing that network infrastructure to be fighting? And then where are you getting the best outcomes in terms of generation? There's a correlation. And so I think too much has sort of been put on the ISOs and RTOs. They're not magicians. They can't make all of this stuff just happen. And so they can get tangled up. I think they're all doing their very best trying to make the system work.
Which brings us back to the affordability question, and which some of the earlier panels today spoke very, very thoughtfully about. I wonder, Sherman, you've been involved in this business for a long time. It strikes me that when I hear regulators talk about these issues, the second most scary thing for them is that they won't be able to generate enough load, enough generation to meet the needs of the load. The second, or the most frightening thing for them is that they will facilitate overbuilding that then will be cost to the consumers, Bob and Betty Bokai? Yes.
In Ohio, it's different names.
So I'm not sure what they are in Mike and Mandy in Michigan, perhaps, or something. So, Sherman, what's your take on that? How do we find that balance that we're going fast enough, but we don't overshoot the mark?
Yeah, I think, kind of taking a step back, I think one of the major issues out there undoubtedly is affordability, right? That's everybody's mindset. Like, we all have to think about affordability. And I do agree with you from the standpoint, I think we're 18, again, the whole market is not PGM, but it, does provide a certain amount of price transparency. 18 months ago, capacity prices were 30, was clearly not providing any price signal to, develop, any generation, and honestly, was providing a price signal to the retirement. Fast forward 18 months, and 18 months is a long time. Given that, I think we've had an interconnection of cancellation PGM for 4 years, right? So, generation is now the price signals, let's build as quickly as possible. So I think part of it is like load growth came on, and then in addition to that, we're seeing the price of building new generation, that has probably, doubled over the past, call it, 3, 4, 5 years. So yeah, there's a conundrum out there. And I think that, purely from a development standpoint, we want to build new generation. We want to do it as affordably as possible. I do think that the longer the price signal can be certain for, the less risk that you're taking in terms of, a return on your investment. And that certainly helps drive down, the overall cost to the consumer. I think we have to weigh that with, what's the overall, cost on the system, and not leaving the existing generation kind of stranded, because that is absolutely a valuable, probably the most valuable component, relative to what the small little sliver of new generation that's needed. Even if we are talking about 20 gigawatts, it's relative to a base of 160 or so, in PJM, and that's mimicked across all different ISOs as well. So yeah, I think affordability is absolutely critical. We have to think about that. I think providing, certainty around, how the markets are structured, and certainly, reducing the volatility around the price signals, certainly helps, reduce the overall investor risk, and therefore the returns that are needed for an investor.
So I was suggesting some things last night to Todd, and he said, "Don't say that to anybody." So I revised it slightly, but if we could think in 20 years what a system might look like, that, and my suggestion is that if generally we think of residential, commercial, industrial, but certainly the heavy industrial, that's in the mind of the small user, that's where the volatility comes from. Maybe not. But when you suddenly add these giant loads on, that's when price volatility can happen. But perhaps if in the future, these heavy users, maybe it's all industrial, but certainly the heaviest of the industrial, they have a separate functioning system that they're in control of, and they're building behind the meter. And the utilities are servicing everyone else, so that if a shopping mall closes, it's not going to disrupt the power grid or the demand or the structure of the pricing. And that of course, and utilities will still and should still get paid for providing that service, but it removes the volatility that both in the demand and the price that we're talking about. So I come up with big ideas and expect somebody else to do something about it. That's what speakers do. So, yeah.
Well, that seems very fair too.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Just worked out well.
So we do have an Ohio specific question here. So the questioner asks, the 9 gigawatt SB power plant in Ohio is twice the size of the largest U.S. nuclear plant and more than twice the size of the largest gas plant. How can Ohio and PJM through Ohio absorb this? So your thoughts?
Well, again, the folks up here are probably going to be able to answer that question, even though they're not Speaker of the House. But we are, I mentioned a poll that I did with some Ohio owners of assets, that Ohio is, on the current pace, is probably, depending on which person you ask, between 5 and 10 years, maybe 7 to 8 years from being a net energy exporter. I'm actually going to ask one of these folks to answer that question, because I don't understand what they mean by absorb. Isn't building more power good? Why is that a bad thing for Ohio? Or what's this question about? So let's ask the experts.
Excellent. I think maybe, Gordon, I'll turn to you. Why is that a challenge to
Can we answer this for me, please?
Why is it a challenge to?
Yeah.
To absorb 9 gigawatts? Why is that not just an unadulterated good thing that we have that much more generation?
Physics. Right, so there's laws of physics going to dictate how much you can connect and then how much you can balance and so forth. So you look at the ISOs, and utilities are doing this well. They take all of the engineering studies to make sure that things stay glued together. And so you have to obey the laws of physics. And so, I was listening to the conversation about flexibility this morning, and I'm going to give credit here to Pablo Vegas, where I heard this idea first, and then I heard it from Lee Davis. I don't know if he's still in the audience this afternoon over dinner last night. And I think you can connect a lot of data centers very quickly to the grid if you made them each come along with a big battery. Right? So I asked Lee this question last night, and I said, so, I've been wondering about this. Given the problems of interconnecting to the grid, why don't data centers just go off grid? I heard some of that conversation earlier this morning. Put in your own backup generation and disconnect. And he said, well, part of the problem is they need very fast ramps. And so, all these CTs that are running behind the scenes can't ramp fast enough to give them the ramp they're looking for. But you can get that ramp from the grid, which is why you want to be connected. Or you can get that ramp from a battery. That's obviously expensive. You've got a gigawatt load. Go put in a 8-hour gigawatt battery is an expensive proposition. So if you can avoid that and have somebody else pay for your ramp, which is the grid, that's what you want to do as a data center provider. But I think if you were to require that of every large data center, they've got the money to pay for it. Then you're also buying flexibility at the same time. It's a win-win. I think there are engineering solutions to this in order to make this work from an engineering point of view. The question is, who pays? So I think you can get some folk together from an engineering perspective. So how do we design this thing so it works properly, and then figure out who pays for what, we can solve this. But instead, what happens is people send in armies of lobbyists to go and get other people to pay for it. I mean, that's kind of the way the system works around this, right? So I think there are solutions. There's solutions in terms of upgrading the network infrastructure. There's solutions in terms of accountability. There's technical solutions on how to make all of this work. But until we start having an honest conversation about how we engineer the system, and then an honest conversation about how we pay for it, we're going to remain stuck throwing rocks at each other.
Right. Thank you. We have a couple questions that relate to firm versus intermittent power supply. And I think since you spoke to some of these issues, I'll turn to you. So I'm going to take a moderator's prerogative and combine a couple of questions. One of them asks if RGGI states, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative states, if they are seeing affordability issues because they have not a technology neutral, but a preferred method of generation. And then the related question is, it asks what kind of incentives can states or RTOs or FERC provide to incentivize firm gas supply and transportation. So you're welcome to answer those questions, or the frame that I've put on as a moderator, which is, should we be technology neutral in how we incentivize power generation, or are there downsides that, especially to intermittency, that we should be taking policy moves to address?
Yeah, look, I think maybe I'll just take a step back. I think at the end of the day, no matter how much load comes out of the system, we need to be able to serve that load and do it reliably and have appropriate reserves. The economic impact to the U.S. or regional areas, if we don't have reliable power, is significant and would outweigh anything that we're talking about here. So I think, I have a special place in my heart for RGGI. It's kind of sarcastic, but as an owner of a plant, RGGI states. But look, we talked about on the last panel, or at least there was discussion about, these are policy decisions in states where they decide to move forward and invoke what they think is right for their state and their constituents. I'm not sure the benefit of RGGI has really flowed through to see, develop what they thought it was going to be of. There's a lot of seams issues and whatnot associated with it. And ultimately, a lot of those RGGI funds that are collected are used for, special purpose projects here and there. Firm gas markets are already starting to take that into account. They're taking into account with our new, at least in the capacity market, through how they credit capacity for different types of resources. I think one of the things, whether you have firm gas supply or storage or backup fuel oil, those are all treated differently in the market. So I think that's starting to make its way in. And the cold spell that we had earlier, I guess in February, we burned more oil than I said we burned in 5 years in northeastern states, and it was needed. And without that, I think there could have been significant issues on the system. So thinking about, this is another area where states have just not stepped up to the plate and allowed for really the realization that it's not that facilities want to go burn fuel oil. Facilities want to have that capability because they need it, because they haven't been able to expand the gas system in a lot of areas, and to be able to, for short periods of time, create bandwidth in the gas system by converting, switching over certain plants over to oil, provides a significant benefit to the reliability of the system. That's something that we should be looking at doing. So look, I think some of these firm type of requirements of facilities are making their way into the market. Facilities are getting paid for that type of service in certain markets, such as in ERCOT and in New York, but not in all markets. So it's a bit of a patchwork system. But there's probably a lot more that we can do there in terms of firming up our supply.
Yeah, Sherman, please.
Yeah, I 100% agree. The gas pipeline supports the need for oil where you don't have utility. Yeah, I did want to comment on Reg. Probably a little bit more adamant that Nate has been. I think, I'm not going to weigh into, what's the reasonable cost for carbon, because that's not my purview. That's up to the policymakers to decide. But I will say that, currently the way that it's structured in some of the states, where some states are in RGGI and some are not, and they're adjacent states, you end up with very perverse outcomes. So, for example, a highly efficient combined cycle in New Jersey is dispatched down, where a peaker in Pennsylvania is dispatched up. You end up with higher cost and more emissions. That does not make sense. So from, we can argue about what the cost of carbon is, but once you get into very perverse outcomes like that, where you're increasing the cost and increasing carbon emissions, that's where I kind of want to throw a red flag. And then I guess the last one is, technology neutral. If, of course, I think that makes a ton of sense. And I do want to comment quickly on Gordon and say 100% agree with you that the problems we're talking about here are not engineering problems. We know how to build generation. We know how to build transmission. This is really a regulatory construct issue. There's enough people in here with engineers. We've got all that technical capability. We can move forward, but it's a matter of getting the permit and getting the cost structure correct to move forward. It's a regulatory issue.
So you hit on actually a question I was hoping we would have time for, which is, what are you seeing at the state level that perhaps was well-intentioned, but is having deleterious or market harming effects? So other than that very nice concrete example that you provided, Sherman, do you have anything else in that category that you'd point to?
I was just going to keep saying Reggie.
Oh, I'm going to say fair enough. Great. Gordon, how about you? How would you answer that?
And let me maybe, sorry.
Oh, no, of course.
But it's in RGGI where the market is partly in RGGI and partly out of RGGI. If you're completely across the the whole region, then it's a matter of a question of what's the right cost of carbon, and that's that's not for me to decide.
So it's
when
the inconsistent.
It's the border issue.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No. So I guess I was thinking about your question. I think there needs to be holistic thinking around how do you, if your policy objective is to decarbonize, which it is in the Northeast and in California and other places, and even in the Midwest, if that's your policy, I think one has to think about how to do it holistically, and also think about the cost trajectory. And so, having observed how this played out, I think there was a lot of disjoint actions that were all sort of well intended, but there was nobody sitting back and saying, let's think about how all these things add up together and what are the actions we have to take holistically in order to make this work. So one of the things, for example, that I've been speaking about for years is that take the gas network free. So it always seemed pretty obvious to me that a decarbonization agenda was going to reduce the average demand for gas, but it was actually going to make the peak demand for gas go up, right? Because gas is the balancing fuel. There's no other technology yet that gives you the duration and the energy volume to balance the system under these adverse weather conditions and cold. And so you look at that and say, well, we don't want to build more pipelines because that becomes stranded infrastructure. I say, well, that's the cost of decarbonization. And you may need to build a pipes that will only last 20 years instead of 40 years. So that gets you through to the place where eventually maybe there's a whole bunch of SMRs in the system where you don't need gas in. But I think saw policymakers act almost too quickly to start constraining the system in the context of saying want to achieve a certain outcome in terms of emissions without thinking about it holistically. And I was having this conversation about how interdependent the gas and the electricity have become. And there's still no way for really systematically paying for the incremental gas network infrastructure we need in order to support electric generation. That's a problem, huge problem, that we haven't solved. It's a structural issue, a regulatory structural issue. And furnaces don't work without electricity. So these two systems are bound together now. And we're not thinking of banning, regulating anything.
Interesting. Thank you. Matt, please.
Well, it's great remarks. In the course of this conversation, we've got from laboratories of democracy to disjointed decision making, and which is it's the same thing. But we're trying to figure out, well, if we like what the decision was, it's laboratories of democracy. If we don't, what are these guys doing over there in Ohio, right? But I mean, that's the way. I think, especially when you have a place like the United States, where we are 50 states that we formed a federal government to deal with federal issues. Now, I know the folks in this town believe that it's a national government, but it's not. It's a federal government, and Ohio is its own sovereign that makes its own decisions. We have a lot of folks who recoil from the concept of entering into interstate compacts on things like licenses for nurses or speech therapists or all sorts of compacts that we have. Nobody likes getting a ticket in Florida and seeing 2 points on your license in Ohio, by the way. Present company not accepted. But with this, it is, and this is where the disjointed decision-making ends up being harmful, is it is all interconnected, especially if you're part of PJM. And, but I think the answer is that states need to step out and do some bold things and have the other states say, well, wait a minute, if they're going to get ahead of us, we need to do it. And for the way that we make decisions as 50 states, and, in the Midwest, it's the Great Lakes states, there's 14 or 15 states. Someone asked me when we came in, are our prices going up in Ohio like they are in the East Coast? Well, I don't think so, because there are things in some East Coast states that they're still required to do that raise the cost of energy that we don't have. In Ohio, some of it we just eliminate. So the laboratories of democracy, I like that part of it.
Yeah, yes. And I was reminded, I saw a panel of some regulators speaking recently, and one of them commented, the last thing that my ratepayers want to hear from me is a reminder that they're paying less than the national average.
Yeah.
Right? Like that just doesn't matter. The bill went up, and that's the perspective. We are sadly almost out of time. This has really been terrific. I'm going to give each panelist a chance to give some final thoughts. So if you each would, think about maybe what's the takeaway you'd like to leave with all of these good smart people in the room here. And I'll start with Kate.
Well, first, just as a resident of Florida, I just hope you paid your a bridge going across and not go. It's 30 miles an hour. I know. It's going 45. Look, I think there's on the state front, we've seen certain states just from their policies and how they've responded to kind of the recent demand growth take different paths. We got into the situation where like certain policy initiatives, caused a lot of facilities to retire. And we, as Sherman mentioned, 18 months ago, we were like, how are we going to keep these facilities around? And now the dynamic has totally changed, and we see certain states really using this as an economic development tool. They have the resources. They want to expand generation supply as well as data centers, as well as other economic development that comes along with that within their states, while others have not. And I think it's a lost opportunity for a fair amount of states. And we're not going to be able to, I look at New England just because it's an isolated little system that has limited gas. And there isn't a lot of data center development going on up there because I think it's going to be very hard to support that load growth and supply that at a reasonable price. And there's other economic areas that will support that much easier. So I'll leave it at that. And Just turn it over to Matt, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, my takeaway or ask that you take away is tell Pure legislator. We've got a couple great ones here. Senator Shane Wilkin, who sponsors Senate Bill 103, which is kind of a corollary to House Bill 15, is also here. Roy Kloffenstein, and they are subject matter experts, but they're not in the industry. They're subject matter experts because they've developed this. And in the area of term limits, like we have in Ohio, experts are regularly leaving because somebody decided that was a good idea. And, we'll say House Bill 15 for the last time, that happened because this organization, through Todd, decided, how about if you do it this way? And explained it to us and advocated for it, and then we were able to do it. But no legislator, I think, is ever going to have the expertise of the other three members of this panel. So if you want good policy, be patient with us. We'll get there. Okay.
That's great. Thank you. Sherman.
Great. Well, first of all, I want to thank Todd, thank EPSA for this, as well as fellow panel members and Kathryn for the opportunity. It's great to see everybody, old friends as new. I guess real quickly, because I understand that myself and Gordon are between, I think, this and drinks. So I'll try to be quick. I want to go back to where Gordon started in terms of the state of things. And I think, I always think of, I like to bike and do things like that. It's like I promise I'll be short. There's a difference between pain and anticipation of pain. And I feel like the anticipation of pain is far worse than the actual pain itself. I feel like that's where we are right now. The reality is the grid is reliable. We just got through the coldest, winter. We had a reliable winter. So right now, in this moment, we're doing quite fine. But yeah, I think it's very reasonable for us all to anticipate what's to come. I think the only thing that's, useful is that if you look around this room, we certainly have the capabilities of building and meeting the moment of rapid load growth, and we can do that. Now, I think democracy and I think capitalism can, at many times in the media, especially the free press, sound very messy. But just because it sounds messy doesn't necessarily mean that it will be a mess. And I think that we will get there. It's going to take a lot of discussions, a lot of conversations. But I have full faith that we'll be able to get there, and I have full faith that we'll be able to meet this moment.
I think those are great points, and I want to build on that because I was thinking along the same lines. So,
Sure.
Drinks. No, I was thinking about democracy and messiness, and so I think what's healthy is the discussions that we're having. I mean, I think you have to start having an honest discussion about what the issues are, and then figure a way forward. I mean, I said that Todd interviewed me on a podcast several months ago, and I said, this is not a country that's going to let the lights go out. And, there might be a blip or two along the way, but it's not like there's going to be a systematic problem with lights going out. I mean, I'm 1,000% confident that we will keep the lights on. So I'm optimistic that we'll find a way through all of this. I think this is a very exciting time. I mean, we're in the bill mode right now. I mean, what's more exciting than that? So we're going to argue a lot about who pays for what, but there's lots of opportunity here. And I think the other point I'd make, I mean, I know that, this is kind of a fraught discussion, but it's not like the decarbonization agenda's gone either, right? So I think we can actually find a way to marry that agenda into the solution in some way, because there are many states are going to want to continue down that pathway. And so I think we've laid the groundwork. I think we know what the issues are. It's now a case of making sure accountabilities are well defined and figuring out who's paying for what. And that's where all the messiness is. I mean, that's where the argument is. And so I'm with you. I think I'd rather be in this situation than in China, for example, even though they look like they've got, a much more organized way of scaling up the grid than we do. I mean, I laugh at times we have designed the most complicated way to keep the lights on in this country.
That's great. Well, I think we will let that be the last word. If you will all join me in thanking our wonderful panel.
That was a panel discussion from the Competitive Power Summit focused on how decision makers can make or break energy investment in their states. As you heard, there's no single solution, but there is broad agreement on a few key themes: the need for clearer accountability, more efficient permitting and siting, and market structures that support long-term investment. And while the challenges are real, the tone of the conversation is also one of cautious optimism that the industry has the tools, the capital, and the expertise to meet rising demand and keep the grid reliable. You can learn more about these issues on our website at EPSA.org and follow us on social media on X at EPSA News and LinkedIn. We'll be sharing more recordings from the Competitive Power Summit here on Energy Solutions and on our YouTube channel, so be sure to check back soon for the rest of the series. The music for this podcast is produced by Let Me Hold That Ltd. Be sure to subscribe and join us next time on Energy Solutions.
Energy Solutions is brought to you by the Electric Power Supply Association. EPSA represents America's competitive power suppliers, bringing about 225,000 megawatts of power generation resources to customers throughout the United States. The music in this episode is written, produced, and performed by Let Me Hold That Ltd. Discover the power of competition at www.epsa.org.